Welcome to my next video in the Steps Method concept series. Today I'm going to discuss key squares. It's one of the pawn ending concepts that is being introduced in step 3. So it's key squares, rook pawn and square of the pawn. The rook pawn and the square of the pawn will be subject to my next video. So for adults who are stepping into step 4, it's important to watch this video, because in step 4 and step 5 we will build on the knowledge that you obtain. The basics is, if the attacking king occupies a key squares, then they are winning. This applies the pawns b to g2, so not the rook pawns. They have different rules. It starts all off with this basic position, and the question is, who is winning, and does it matter who is to move? People who use opposition as a rule for pawn endings might be confused here, because it doesn't matter who's to move, white is winning. So if white is to move and white plays king d6, black follows, we can see that white is still winning. And it's very important to know pawn on the 5th rank with the king in front of it, and it's a winning position. So if black is to move, of course, it's even more simple. After king b7, king c8, king b7, white is winning because black cannot stop the promotion of the pawn. So what are the key squares? If the pawn is on the 1st to the 4th rank from the perspective of white, it is 2 squares ahead and the square in between. So I call it a knight move forward and the square in between. And of course for black it is mirrored, so it's the ranks 8 to 5, and it's 2 squares ahead and 1 to the left and 1 to the right. So again, a knight move and a square in between. Once the pawn is on the 5th rank or higher, it is 1 square ahead, so it's like a pawn move and a capture of a pawn. And of course it's very logical if you remember the basic position where we had a pawn on the 5th rank, and if the king is in front of that pawn, that is already a winning. So there's one, you could say, minor exception, but I mean it's completely logical. If a pawn is on the 7th rank, again it's a pawn move ahead and a capture of the pawn, you could say, but also in this case b7 and d7. So what is the rule, right? So you white to play and win, you identify the key squares, you occupy them, and then you play to get to the standard position. So in this case, we identify the key squares, we occupy them, and then we get to the standard position, and we know it's always white who is winning here, irrespective of who is to play. So there's the direct link between getting to the key squares and obtaining the standard position, and we have both pieces of knowledge and we can apply it, and that is the link between the two. So in this case, right, let's identify the key squares. The key squares, the pawn is still on the 1st to the 4th rank, so it's a knight move ahead and a square in between. So the key squares are here. Now we have to figure out the route that gives us maximum chances to occupy a key square. And of course, a general principle in a pawn ending is not to be shielded off by the enemy king. So we don't play king f3 because after king f5 there's no chance that we get to the key squares, but we go king h3, and after king f5, king h4. We threaten to go king h5 and get to a key square, so the only move for black to prevent it is king g6, but after king g4 we get to a key square after all. So that's the basic rule. You identify them, you try to occupy them, and then you get to the standard position. it's very critical. So in this case, right, white is on the key square of the pawn on c2 on b4, because the key squares are b4, c4 and e4. But if you make a pawn move, there will be new key squares. So we have to be very careful of making pawn moves and make certain, before we make that pawn move, that the new squares that occur are squares that we can occupy with our king. So if we would play here, let's say c3, the new key squares of this pawn of c3 will be b5, c5 and d5. And after king b6, we don't have a chance to occupy the key squares. So we have to prepare the advance of the pawn. And we do that, in this case, by playing king c4, and after king b6 we play king d5, and now we are on a key square of the pawn on c3. So be careful with playing pawn moves and look at what happens to the key squares if you play them and if you can continue to occupy them. In the starting position, white was winning, but he could spoil it by playing their pawn. So in this case, black is to move, right? It's always next to the square h1, you can identify who is to move. And I call this rule anticipate. So we know on the next, right, if we look to the key squares, it's on the 4th rank, so we are still a knight move ahead and the square in between. We anticipate on the next move that white will try to occupy that by going either king c5 or king b5. In that case, right, we want to be on c7 if the king is on c5 and on b7 if the king is on b5. So we have to anticipate king c5 and king b5. We know in those cases that we want to be on the next move on b7 or c7, and the move that gives us the flexibility to reply to both moves is king b8. Then king b5, and we play king b7, and white is unable to occupy the key squares. So this is what I call anticipate your opponent's moves. So what's going on here? Black is to move again. And of course, the key squares of the current pawn are those 3. And white just threatens simply to eat the pawn and be on a key square, and white obtains a winning position. So black actually doesn't have to think, because this is the last moment that black is able to change the structure by playing d4, and after e takes d4. Now black has to think again and use this anticipate rule. So on the next move, right, we can expect white to play either king f5 or king e5, going to the key squares of this pawn, of the pawn d4, which are e6, d6 and c6. And black says, if white plays king f5, I'd like to be on f7. If white is on e5, I'd like to be on e7. So the move that makes that happen is to move king f8, and after we can go here. So let's look at this position, right? If white would play king f7, black would play king f7, white would play king f5, and then white is able to occupy the key squares. So pause the video if you're interested and look at this position. What can black do? So white's king is very active, and how to make a draw here basically for white. I mean, black doesn't have any winning chances, and a lot of players would say, I have to take the opposition. Again, this rule of opposition, but it's not applied at the right moment here, because after f5, king e7, king c6, king e8, king d6, you can see that black's king is being squeezed out, and now we have obtained the basic position and white is winning. So king d7, which is for a lot of players a very logical move to play, loses to f5. So the way to solve this position is to say, okay, if I have to give up my f-pawn, is there a future position that is a draw? So we know that the key squares of the pawn on f4 currently are e6, f6 and g6. And so if we envision a position where the white king has taken the black pawn on f5, we know it's a draw, right? So if we say the white king has taken the pawn, we know it's a draw if black is on f7, because that would block the white king from going to one of the key squares. So the solution here is not to try to block the white king from entering, because you get side squeezed. No, you give up the pawn by playing f5, and after king e5, we anticipate that on the next move, white is going to play king takes f5. So we prepare by going king f8, and after white takes, we play king f7 and obtain the draw. So you have learned about this position. So you can apply the same here to this position, right? A lot of players, when they would say, look at this, they would say, okay, let me go king d7 and then c5, and then of course there are two options, c6, after king b6, king d8. We reach the standard position and we know that white is winning irrespective of who is to play. So king d7, I mean, after c5, we have more options and we revert to the position that we had before. Right, king b6, king c8, and again we get the draw by giving up the pawn and going to a future position where we can block the white king from obtaining one of the key squares, b6, c6 or d6. Of course, white has to be careful. We see here the pawn on a5. We know that the key squares are those. White could play the pawn to b6 and say, well, I'm on a key square, I must be winning. Yes, it's stalemate. So with the b and the g pawn, we have to be careful not to create a stalemate. But in this case, it is white is winning by just going to the a file and pushing their pawn. And this is a way to win. So we have to be careful if we look to the b and the g pawn, that there are certain stalemate motives, and that we don't go blindly and play b6 and say, hooray, I'm on a key square, I'm winning, and then realize the game is over because of stalemate. So if we look to the rule of the key squares, it says if white is on a key square, right, white is winning. It doesn't say if white is not on a key square, it's a draw. It also doesn't say if the defending king is on a key square, it's a draw. No, it only says if the attacking king is on a key square, then the attacking king is winning. Because in this case, we know that the key squares are these three. And again, if people who like the opposition might say, oh, this is a draw if white is to move, and it's a win if black is to move, because black has to give up the opposition. Well, this position is winning irrespective of who's to move. So let's say white is to move, that's a more difficult case. King f5, king g8, and now after king f6, king f8, it would be indeed a draw, but white plays king g6, king f8, king f6, king e8 and e7, and then white has to give up, black has to give up the square f7 and white promotes. So to come back to this position, why is actually white winning? Because black doesn't have the square f7 available. But the important thing I wanted to highlight here is that this rule of if you occupy a key square, you are winning, that is correct. But it doesn't say if you're not occupying a key square, you are not winning. And this is a very good example of that. Of course, when we look at the position where black is to move here. And we saw in the previous version what happens after king g8, because white plays king g6. So let's assume that black plays king f8, king f6, king e8, e7, king d7, king f7, and white is winning. Okay, finally, 2 questions. The first one is this one. How should black capture the pawn? All right. So, and what's the difference? So take a moment to analyze for yourself. Does it matter? Can black make a draw? Or what's the difference between the 2 captures? Should black capture with the king or should black capture with the rook? So if black captures with the rook, we say, what are the key squares of the pawn on f3? How are we going to approach those key squares? Well, we saw before that we don't want to be shielded off by the black king, so we're going to take the route as far away from the black king. So we play king g3, king e6, king g4, threatening king g5, after king f6. White plays king f4, king g6, the black king has to blink, and after king e5 we occupy one of the key squares. So it does matter. So we go back. Rook d7 was a losing move. We play king takes d7, and we assume that white exchanges and doesn't go into a draw rook ending. Now we see that black has to anticipate 2 moves, right? So we do again the anticipation rule, this move and this move. In that case, black wants to be either here or here, and of course the key squares are those 3. So to have the flexibility to go either to f6 or g6, black plays king f7, and after king g4, king g6, king f4, king f6, it's a draw. When we go back to the beginning, of course, if you don't want to think and calculate, you can say after the captures, what's the difference? In one case, the king is on d7, and in the other case, the king is on e7. And of course, if you're on e7, you have more chance to draw the game than when you are on d7 because you're further away. Final example. So let's look at this position. White is to move. Black threatens to play simple king d4 and then eat the pawns on c4 and b4. And then, of course, has 2 extra pawns. So the question is for white how to make a draw in this position. And we can change structure like we saw before. We can push c5. But now the question is, should we first play king e2? And then after the king approaches, we play c5, or should we play c5 now? Take a moment to calculate for yourself, does it matter or doesn't it matter? So if we play king e2, right, the king goes to d4 after c5, and last moment we can sacrifice our pawn before they get eaten. And now we see that the key squares of this pawn on b6 are a4, b4 and c4, and white cannot prevent black from occupying those key squares. So if we go back and to the position after king e2 and we say, what if we play immediately c5? c5, d takes c5, b takes c5. Now the pawn has to take, and now king e2. And we see that the key squares of the pawn on c5 are these 3 squares, and the black king is unable to occupy those 3 key squares. So going back to the start, so the difference between the 2 moves, king e2 and c5, was that in the case of king e2, the black king could take on c5, and as a result, the key squares shifted up 1 rank, so not the third rank, but the fourth rank. So in case of c5, immediately the key squares were on the third rank, and in case of king e2 followed by king d4, the key squares were on the fourth rank, and the white king was too far away to limit the black king from getting there. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe, and I hope you also watch my next video, which will be on the rook pawn and the square of the pawn. Thank you very much.